how does a leader actually implement a culture plan or a culture strategy in place? If you've been following us in the past, culture planning is one of the things that we really talk about, and we'll talk about it a little more today. But the idea is this: as a business leader, you make a plan for the things that you care about. You probably have a business plan, you probably have a marketing plan, and you probably have a sales plan. Well, if you say you care about culture, you also need a culture plan. You need a strategy, otherwise, you don't know how to get to where you're trying to get to. And so I started off by asking a bunch of business leaders who is in charge of culture in an organization. And let's face it, 100% of people gave me the same response, which was the CEO, the boss. Whatever the title is, the number one person in that organization is in charge of culture. And I think that's important, but I think there's a lot of caveats to us saying that the business leader is in charge of the culture. And here's why. I wholeheartedly agree that culture has to start from the top with the CEO. The priorities have to come from the business leader, otherwise, nobody else is going to give them the time of day. And the leader has to be invested in the culture. Otherwise, no matter how much money he throws at culture consultants, it's never going to come to fruition with his or her vision for that organization. I also find that when I talk to business leaders who do say that HR is the one that's in charge of culture, which does happen, even though it shouldn't, I know that there's going to be a culture problem when I really get into talking about that team. Because once again, like if the emphasis doesn't come from the leadership, if they think it's somebody else's job, that's a problem. That being said, no matter how much leaders want to care about culture, there's also an equal and opposite thing that they have to care about, which is making money. As an organization, whether you're a nonprofit or a for profit, you have to make money. Otherwise, you won't stay in business. And this is especially true for small businesses, for startups, which are a lot of you who are listeners out there. If you don't make money, you're not going to stay in business. And a lot of times, operations and culture, so the decision that you have to make for business or making money, and the decisions that you have to make for culture can be diametrically opposed to each other. So, how do you know if you're balancing it right? How do you work that into your plans? And how is the leader supposed to keep culture as his ultimate goal above everything if he or she has to focus on making money all the time? I've struggled with this question. I've asked a lot of different business leaders this question. We've done a lot of reading and research here at Cavness HR, and I have some thoughts that I'd like to share with you. And it starts off with this whole question reminds me of my time in the military. So I was an intelligence officer in the military. I was a lieutenant and a captain, deployed twice to war, and what I did as a fairly junior officer was I ran the team that was responsible for advising the commander, who's the decision maker, who's the business leader, on security and intelligence, which is to say, they did the operations planning and they consulted me and my team to tell them anything that could go wrong with the plan that they were making. That was what we had input into. And so it's an interesting thing in the military is that you have operations and you have security, which security and intelligence was kind of my role. And these two are opposed to each other because let's say your job as the commander is to take your team and go take this village, take over this village. And my job is to try to help you bring everyone home alive. Well, the best way to bring everyone home alive is generally to not go anywhere near the village that has the bad guys with the guns. And so when we say things like culture is our number one goal, security is our number one goal, that's sort of a too simplified answer when we start talking about operations, because of course, the operation is our number one goal and the security is our number one goal. When you have two number one goals, what is going to happen? They are going to pull in opposite directions of each other. And as the leader, your job is to help balance them. The military does some interesting things because they know that this dichotomy exists. And what they do in operations versus security is sort of two things, and we can't get into it that deeply, but very briefly. First of all, is there are operations planners and there are security planners that are both advisors to the business leader, the decision maker. And both the operations planners and the security planners have no decision making authority or ability or responsibility. And that is important because that depressurizes us from having to worry or be concerned with the outcome of the operation. And it allows us to just focus on asking the questions, getting the relevant information, and presenting all sides of the equation to the business leader who then makes the decisions. So the CEO, as always, still has all of the pressure, still has to have his focus on, I should say, her focus, because of course women are business leaders too. Still has to have her focus on the right things, but can also be allowed to focus on, let's say, the operations, the desired outcome of the event or the decision that they have to make, but still have all of the advice of all of the different things that they have to consider coming in at the same time. So that's the first thing, is no decision making ability for the advisors. The second thing is that they know and they acknowledge that operations and security are completely opposite and often diametrically opposed to each other. And by acknowledging that, they're able to set it up very specifically as a tug of war that can be used to keep balance. And balance is part of life in military planning and business planning and culture planning and in everything else. You have to have a balance. Um, so let's translate all of this back into business terms, because I hope I didn't just lose you all by talking about military planning. But in business terms, culture, which I'm comparing to that security role, culture and operations can often be diametrically opposed. So sometimes the decision that makes the most profit can be harmful to the culture. But on the flip side, if you just shut your doors and have offsites and do team building and do town halls and communications workshops, you're going to go out of business. You're going to have a fuzzy, lovely, warm culture where everyone feels connected and everyone feels happy, but it's not going to last for very long because you can't pay to keep the lights on and you can't pay your employees. So instead of asking the question, which is more important, profit or culture, we need to be asking, how can both of these be balanced? If we're on too far to the extreme or another, all of you who are parents probably understand that a seesaw only works if it's balanced, or a tug of war, or whatever other imagery you like here. So there's four things that we can look at doing when we talk about how we're going to balance operations versus culture. Let's just go ahead and call it profit. Profit, money making, keeping the lights on versus a culture where all of our employees are happy and fulfilled. And the first is to make an actual plan. I talked about it earlier today. I've talked about it in past live streams and we'll do it in the future. There's many, many, many different ways, different methodologies for culture planning, for strategizing. The most important thing is that you do it. The most important thing is that you get down on paper, spend the time with your fellow business leaders, with your key leaders in your organization, deciding what are your values? What are your missions? And how does that all translate into the ultimate culture that you are trying to produce and any culture change that you're trying to stimulate along the way? We have our own theory here at cavnesshr. We have a very simple template and a very simple meeting where we can walk you business leaders through exactly what this culture strategy and forecasting looks like. So if you're interested, check out the blog. There is a easy button that you can find more information, schedule a call. We'd be happy to discuss this more. But back to the points. Point number one is make an actual plan. Make a plan for your culture. Point number two is you can appoint someone to be your culture advisor. This person doesn't need to have any kind of specific or formal training. They should be somebody that you trust as a business leader and that you think, to the best of your knowledge, exemplifies the value and the aspects of the culture that you're trying to create in your organization. If you've watched me before, you know work-life balance is one of my favorites. So, work-life balance doesn't have to be in your culture, but if it is in your culture and it is something you're trying to prioritize, don't appoint the person to be your culture person that works 80 hours a week without you even having to ask her to. They're not going to be the person that is going to be the best to advise you on how to establish work-life balance as one of the tenets of your culture. So this goes back to the planning. You got to figure out what the tenets are, what the baseline is of your culture, and then you can pick a person that is already doing a lot of these things well, and you can set them up as the culture person. By appointing someone, it not only takes the pressure off of you as the business leader to have to be in charge of everything all the time and make all the right decisions, but it helps one person focus in on a niche. And it also takes the pressure off of that person because they've been appointed to do this. When I was the security officer in the military, I didn't care if people rolled their eyes at me at every meeting, anytime I had to raise my hand to be like, well, what about keeping people alive? What about locking these doors or checking on these enemy over here? That'll kind of work the same way in your organization. There's a person that everyone knows their job is to raise their hands and say, what about the culture? I understand this new product we're going to launch is going to do all of these amazing things for our profit, for our organization, for our stakeholders, and for our bottom line. But how do we think it's going to impact the culture? It's not to say it's good or bad, but let's talk about it. It is that person's job when every decision is being made to raise her hand and say, what about the culture? Have we thought about it? Have we talked through it? Have we written out the metrics that we want to keep track of once we do this operation so that we can learn from it and so that we can see whether it's going according to plan or not? So your team doesn't have to be super big for this. Your team can literally be you and one more person, and you can set up an operations person and a culture person. This is something simple. This is something that takes practice, but it doesn't take any money. So for a small business, here you go. Hopefully this is one of the useful tips. So number 1 was make an actual plan. Number 2 was appoint someone to be your culture gal or guy and to be in charge of that. Step number 3 is understand the opposite extremes. Understand that culture and operations often are diametrically opposed to each other, and that's okay. You want to have a balance. You don't want a world where all you care about is profit and the bottom line, because that doesn't take care of people. You also don't want a world where all you're doing is trying to take care of people's emotions, soft skills, or other non super desperate needs, and you're ignoring making the money, which keeps you in business, keeps the lights on, and allows you to continue to build that culture. So, understanding that there's a balance and understanding that you can't ignore sound operations in favor of cultivating culture, but you also can't cultivate culture to the detriment of everything else. Once you acknowledge this reality, you get closer to a healthy balance, and everyone gets to play tug of war and have some healthy competition, and that's fun too. Okay, so you've made a plan, you've appointed someone to be the culture advisor. You and all of your people understand that your culture advisor and your operations advisor are going to be playing tug of war sometimes, and that's okay, and that's how it should be. Number 4 then is don't be afraid to take calculated risks. If you're too afraid to step outside the wire because you're so afraid that there might be somebody waiting out there to shoot you, you'll never get anything done. In our military analogy, that's the same thing is true in business. Risks is part of operations, whether you're going to war or whether you're launching a new product. And so you have to be prepared to take some well-calculated risks. But now that you've done planning, you've appointed your culture guy, and you thought through these extremes that we want to steer clear of, you're going to be on path to take the calculated risks. And that's where the job of the business leader is really coming in. It's listening to all those different people, hearing all those different perspectives, allowing yourself to be reminded by your planners what the things to consider are, and then going ahead and making the decision and marching forward. part of making that decision too is the follow-up, right? So never forgetting to make sure that you have the right metrics, you have the right predicted outcomes so that after the operation, after the new product launch, after the new sales push, you are able to look back and see what happened. Did it meet our goal? Is it what we thought? And is this something we want to sustain or improve for future operations? Finally, let's not forget that everybody's job is nobody's job. So, yes, culture is important. Yes, culture affects everyone. But if it's not planned, if it's not defined, and if certain people are not appointed to be its champion, there's a very good chance that it may not be getting done. Thank you all so much for listening live or rewatching, however, you're getting this. We really, really appreciate your feedback. We really love you to subscribe to our channels, and we will be doing this every week. My name is Daniela Young. I am a culture, strategy, and leadership development advisor with Cavness HR, TEDx speaker, and proud Army veteran. And I am more than happy to connect with you on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, or anywhere else that you engage for business. I am there and I am able to be reached out to. I would love suggestions on topics that you would like us to research, write about, deep dive into here at Cavness HR. Cavness HR is a virtual HR company for small businesses. If you have under 49 employees, you likely don't need and possibly can't afford a full-time HR person, but you do need full-time HR coverage and protection and expertise. And that is what we are great at. We do it on a monthly subscription basis, and we are at your service around the clock for HR, for culture, for innovation, for diversity and inclusion, and many, many other things that fall under the umbrella of HR, culture, and leadership. Thank you so much and have a wonderful Tuesday.